Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see so many of you here today. Today we have my long-term collaborator and friend Gijs Schumacher to present some of his work. He told me that he was going to try to do a mix between what the psychologists do, putting 20 studies in 20 slides, and what the political scientists do, talk a lot about theory and implications, and perhaps present one regression model. So it's going to be somewhere in between. I've seen the sneak preview of it, and it looked really interesting. Those of you who are a little newer in the room, we will have Gijs will talk for about 20 minutes, and then there is time for Q&A, so feel free to ask questions, also if you are online in the Zoom environment. So Gijs, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Bert. And I want to start with something we also always forget, and that is to thank sponsors, and in particular this one here, the European Research Council. For preparing this presentation, I had to think of the interview I had to give for the European Research Council 5 years ago that eventually led me to obtain the starting grant that has financed a lot of the research that I will present today. There was so you're being interviewed for 15 minutes. It's of course very stressful. There's this jury member that at one point asks me something, and she starts with saying like, "I'm really happy that you're taking the effective turn." And to me, at that stage, the effective turn, well, that related to a very specific branch in international relations, highly qualitative sort of research, not at all something that I would personally identify with. So during that interview, I felt, well, I mean, if she reads there that I'm taking the effective turn, that's probably something very good. It's probably means she's on my ship. And I guess the fact that I received the grant is also evidence of that thought. So the effective turn in IR, but also in sociology, there's now for 20 years all kinds of research that takes this particular perspective. But I think now their effective turn is broad enough. And so I think there's also an effective turn ongoing.
It's a tradition, right?
Yep. I think there's also an effective turn ongoing in political behavior / compared politics. And that's what I want to talk about today. And so, as Bert already said, this is going to be, as I would call it, a hybrid presentation. It's hybrid because it's online and offline, but it's also hybrid in the sense that I will indeed try to do what psychologists do, to discuss 20 studies in 20 slides, but I will also try to discuss one specific paper, so that's more the political science typical sort of approach. And so that's what I'll try to do. The specific paper that I will talk about is labeled Affective Representation, hence the title of this talk. And with effective representation, I have a very specific understanding of that in that paper. But broadly, just to give you a little bit of a teaser, is that I think of, I mean, my earlier work before I took the effective turn was on representation. And it was very much about the question about the quality of representation. How well are the policy preferences of citizens represented in the political arena? And so this is very much about what politicians say and what citizens hear. And so my newer work is much more about how do politicians say it, right? So this is what I mean with the effective turn. How are policies and positions, perspectives discussed by politicians, and how are these processed by citizens? And so today I'm hoping to take you a little bit on a tour throughout different approaches to this very broad question. And it won't be a very clean narrative. I've actually labeled some of the slides literally detours. Yes, I know what I'm doing. We're just taking a long, winding road towards the regression tables that Bert already announced. And then at the end, I'll do some sort of conclusion, which also doesn't really feed back onto what I've said. So this is the type of presentation you're allowed to give when you have the privileges of an associate professorship. So don't do this at home, kids. Now, this system of effective representation, I think this is something that political science can uniquely bring to the affective sciences in general, right? So most of the affective sciences, that's just typically a synonym for psychology, and it's very much individual, micro-oriented, thinking about how people see the world and process things. As political scientists, we're of course more used to thinking about systems. And the effective turn or effective representation, that's a system. So, for example, we could describe this as at the basic micro level with citizens who have specific emotional needs. Then there are politicians who appeal to these citizens, and these appeals are also emotional. And these appeals, they influence citizens also through emotional and cognitive processes. At the same time, citizens do not only listen to politicians, they also exchange views with each other and with politicians. And there also emotion comes back. So you see there are 4 completely different ways in which emotions or affect play a role in the larger system of democracy we have. So it's a system with many components. And this also explains why here in the Hot Politics lab, we do a lot of different things. We look at emotions in a lot of different ways. So the way in which I'm going to explain this effective turn in political science will have a very strong emphasis on what we've done here in the lab. Of course, there's a lot of other interesting ongoing work in emotions in other labs. Let's not forget it. But I will talk about 3 different things. So first, I want to talk about a little bit about a renewed interest in emotions in political science. Then I'm going to specifically talk about a little bit about emotional appeals in text. And then I'm going to the unique contribution that political science has made so far to the affective sciences, and that is the concept of affective polarization. So, detour number 1. Emotions have multiple components. So, there's a lot of research done in political science, communication science. There's a lot more of this on emotions than there was 10, 20 years ago. But there is one thing that that is very similar in all of this research, is they are all very much in love with the self-reports. So emotions only exist in most of this research as a label that participants give to a particular state they think they experience. But emotions have multiple components. If you ask, if you would try to define emotions, it is always this sort of complicated episode of unconscious and conscious processes, appraisals, action tendencies, and their feedback processes from trying to label something back to unconscious processes again, trying to update what your label was. So what I'm getting at is that if we want to study emotions, then only look at this very end product of the self-report, but we should look at the entire process. And I think here in the lab, we've tried to make a unique contribution to that in the last few years. For example, through facial electromyography research that Bert and Matthijs and I and Mike Homan have been doing in the last few years, through EEG research that Diamantis Petropoulos-Petalos has done in our lab, but also to research emotions in the wilds, in the forest, in this particular case. So you see here these 2 stickers, they're measuring the arousal of a participant in an experiment we did last summer in Terschelling. Matthijs Roudijn was the main researcher there. Now, this is the odd one out here. I already mentioned appraisals. I mean, a core aspect of emotions are their links to appraisal. So the links, how participants, people evaluate their circumstances. And so particular appraisals of the situations link with particular emotional episodes. But interestingly, nobody really, specifically political science researchers, these appraisals. We just take it for granted, or we maybe use one or two of them to design an experiment. And so in recent research, Isabella de Basso and me and Matthijs Roduin, we had people writing essays about emotions they've had in politics. So that was half the group. The other half of the group was asked to write an essay about an emotion they've experienced in their personal life. And so after doing this, we asked them to appraise the situation they had just written about. And so these are all kinds of different appraisal levels. So you can see it's pretty complicated. There are lots of different labels here. And to cut a very long story very short, what we find in the political conditions, this is the output of the political condition, is that these appraisals between people who've experienced anger and anxiety do not actually seem to differ at all. Putting back into question whether the emotion labeling of anger and anxiety is a meaningful distinction at all. Now, of course, I'm taking detours and also shortcuts. So if you have questions about that, then of course we have a Q&A and maybe some time after that as well. Okay, so that was the first point here, renewed interest in emotions. Then emotional appeals in text. These are typically completely separate communities, people who analyze expressions, who analyze elite level behavior, and people who analyze individual level behavior. And this is a pity. There's little exchange between them theoretically. Typically, the people interested in elite behavior, they just shop a little bit in psychological theory to make sure of the stars they find in their regression tables. But if we conceive of effective representation as a system, then we should make sure that there is sufficient interaction between the two different approaches, but also that they build upon each other. And this is something that Christian People has been doing in our lab in the last few years. And and he's been trying to study emotional appeals, so the appeals politicians make. And he's been trying to capture that by looking at the polarity and the arousal in political speeches. And then the next step is to try to explain this variation in the direction, polarity, and level arousal of these emotional appeals. Well, you see all these dots all over the place, and you see these snakes running through them. Well, one way to interpret that is that, and these are different countries, 7 different European countries. One way to interpret this very easily is that there's no pattern. Right? And this is in sharp contrast with what lots of people typically believe about politics. If you have to believe the newspapers, we're sort of in this terminal decline towards ever more negative political rhetoric. And there's really absolutely no evidence of that. Interestingly, we can barely explain the variation in emotional appeals if it takes place. And so we've looked at partisanship, economic and cultural trends, gender, party size. We cannot explain this variation. The only thing that systematically works across all of these countries, that if your party gets into government, you as a politician become more positive. That's the only thing that seems to be systematically related to emotional appeals. There's a little shout out here to the reviewers who are currently keeping this paper on the desk for 6 months already. Then on to the unique term that the political science brings to the affective sciences, namely affective polarization. There's, of course, a huge, an exploding increase. Maybe that's a double, well, anyway. There's a lot of research on affective polarization. It's very popular. It's so popular, the ECPR now is a standing group on affective polarization. I'm not familiar with any sort of concept that has its own standing group. I mean, that a standing group in political parties or political communication makes sense, but to have, well, anyway, it must be a lot of fun. The problem of this affective polarization literature is really the affective part. This is all again based on self-reports. How much do you dislike a member of the out party? And of course, people dislike members of the out party. It works in Europe and US, but what does it mean? Now, one way to look at this is through the lens of the work that Maaike Homan has been doing in our lab. And this is a paper published together with me, facing emotional politicians. Do emotional displays of politicians evoke mimicry and emotional contagion? Now, what we've done here is, so this, the ears, we've measured this facial electromyography measure that I've shown on one of the first slides. And we were interested in how different are responses to politicians from the in party and out party, to normal faces. And the normal faces are called ATFES here. That's just a data set of normal faces. Now, and these faces, they also have emotional expression. So angry, happy, or neutral, angry, happy, or neutral. Now, and we can stare at this for a long time, but I will tell you what's the most important thing is that basically these pictures differ, right? So that how we respond to politicians differs from how we respond to normal people. And that's not in line with psychological theory. So there seems to be some, the context of politicians seems to bring a special sort of physiological response already. But also, what is even more interesting is that these two pictures also do not align. So to pick out one particularly funny finding is that the zygomaticus muscle, so that's the muscle here on your cheekbone, it's a muscle associated with positive emotions. If you smile, that's the muscle that moves. Now look at this, the angry condition and the out party leader. So you see an angry out party leader, what do? You smile. That fucking idiot. And so this is a different sort of response than this. I mean, there's always apparently some little smiling response, but it's much, much stronger than to normal people and also stronger than to the in party. And this is not really what should happen here is that there's more corrugator activity. So that's the muscle here that is associated with angry expressions. But this doesn't happen at all. So in my mind, what this is a little bit of evidence that there is indeed a real affective dimension to affective polarization. Now on to affective representation. So this is the paper hidden into this larger presentation. There's more and more work. For example, Andrea Fiek presented this in our lab 2 years ago. It was online, I think. Presented the paper on feeling represented. So in addition to concepts such as substantive representation, how close is the policies that are being proposed to your own preferences, or descriptive representation, how much do you see yourself descriptively represented in members of parliament? You can also talk about the feeling represented. So how much do I feel represented by a politician? And so she proposed a set of questions to measure this, and a very similar attempt was undertaken by this De Mulder 2022 paper. And so this is very interesting because it's also really about tries to be about the how of politics, as I explained in the beginning. There's of course also a relationship between the two. If you agree with someone, you're also probably more likely to agree with the style in which this agreement is communicated. Maybe also the other way around. If you really like someone's anger, you may also be more likely to like the policy positions that this person takes. And so thinking about these things, I went back to this older literature I worked in on representation, and I thought the essence of that work is a congruence between what you want and what is offered. So typically then we look at policies, right? But what I think would be really interesting is to look at the congruence between what you want in terms of emotions and what is offered in terms of emotions. So that's how I'm going to conceptualize affective representation. It's similar to feeling represented, but this is still about whether people feel substantively represented. So mine is not about substance, it's about the how more directly. So just in any other study on representation, I'm going to look at the absolute distance between a citizen's preference and a representatives difference. And the representative can be a party leader or a government leader, or it can be a party. In the case of the data I will show you today, it's the party leader, but it can be something else. Now I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. Just to summarize, there are different ways of assessing this than just taking the absolute least. So I've conducted an exploratory analysis where I'm going to look at effective distances between how much an emotion is used by the party leader and how much citizens want this party leader to use this emotion. And this is all subjective, right? This is not an objective measurement of how much the party leader uses this. It could be that you're completely mistaken, but it's your opinion and it's your right to have it. So effective these different emotions. So I asked people about 6 discrete emotions and to rate the party leader's use of emotion on a 1 to 7 scale. Now, use 2 representative samples from the US and the Netherlands, and there's a slight difference between how I asked these questions between the two. So in the Netherlands, I asked 2 questions. I said, how much does the party leader use it on a 1 to 7 scale? And how much do you want your leader to use this on a 1 to 7 scale? And then I take the difference. In the United States, I did slightly different. I simply asked, do you want your leader to use more or less of this emotion? So it's slightly different, but it's the same conceptual idea. Now, onto the data. This is the Netherlands. 3 discrete emotions: anger, fear, and disgust. Negative emotions are the sum of these. Okay. I didn't include all the parties that didn't fit. And so for every party that has fewer than 40 people in the survey that voted for this party, I excluded those. Okay. So these are the opinions of people who voted for that party. So people who voted for the VVD here, you see, they want their leader to use more anger. So this bar is orange and this is transparent. This means this is a significant effect and this is not. Significantly different from 0. And so you can look at all of these bars and draw your conclusions. So Green Party members want their leader to be less negative, same D66, and then the VVD, they want their leader to be more negative. Sorry. Now,
what do the colors signify?
Significance.
Oh, okay.
No. Same I did for positive emotions: enthusiasm, pride, hope. And again, this is the summation of these 3. And interestingly, I mean, we all know that Mark Rutte, the leader of VVD, likes to smile a lot. Well, his voters don't agree. They want him to be less enthusiastic and more angry, as we saw in the previous one. And this again sums it up. So particularly on the left, people want their leaders to be more positive, and on the right, the preferences are a bit more negative. But especially this Farmers Party here, and they don't like positive emotions. Now, I did this in the US as well. Looks a little different because there are not that many parties. So I asked about Joe Biden, and there is one more emotion, sadness. And so these are the preferences of Democratic partisans. They want Joe Biden to be less negative and more positive. All the emotions are basically in the same line. All the results are significant. We, of course, have many more people per cell than in the Netherlands because there are just 2 blocks instead of, I don't know, what are we at? 18 or something, different blocks in the Netherlands. Now, here's the big surprise. These are the preferences for Donald Trump's emotional rhetoric. Republican partisans want Donald Trump to be much, much less negative. It's literally off the charts here, right? So this is a 2 points on the 1 to 7 scale. So it's a huge effect. And then they also want him to be more positive. And I'm definitely hoping that this is a representative sample of Republicans. But any ideas on how to evaluate that are very much welcome, other than just gender and age, because. Now, next question is, who feels more effective distance? Right, so we basically take these bars that you saw on the previous page, and then we try to explain the distance they experience, not so much with the party label, but with other variables. And here I'm going to show you the left-right position, and here the liberal-conservative position for the US. So is ideology related to your emotional preferences? And so starting with on top, you see the two plots for the Netherlands. And here is negative emotions. And there's a little bit of an ideological asymmetry here. There's actually quite strong ideological asymmetry here, in the sense that the left-wing people, the people here, they score on average negative on the negative emotions. So they want their leader to use less negative emotions. The right-wing people here, particularly here, score positive, meaning they want their leader to use more negative emotions. So if you draw a regression line here, this would be a statistically significant regression line. In positive emotions, it's a little bit more complicated. It seems like the extremes want the leader to be less positive. And if you use an extreme as a measure in a regression analysis, that will give you a significant. Now, in the United States, starting again with the negative emotions here, look at the scales. This is all, everyone across the board want their leaders to be less negative, okay? And the people who want this the most are people in the center, and people on the extremes are, they score a little less low. Yes. Positive emotions, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It seems again a little bit like that the extremes it's actually reversed, and in the Netherlands, the extremes seem to want more positive emotions. But this is not a significant relationship. Now, what is also interesting, I'm not going to show you that, is the effect of sophistication. But first, let's take another detour. So ideological asymmetry has been an important aspect to our work. So for those of you unfamiliar with the term, it's the difference between liberals and conservatives, or left-wing and right-wing people, in how they process information and how they experience life in general. And so there are a lot of different ideological asymmetries to be found, but it's also there are also a lot of rejections of that hypothesis. And so in this lab, I tried to make an overview of what we found so far using really different research designs. And I think this is really quite interesting. So we find no ideological asymmetry in physiological responses to threatening stimuli. Work with Bert, Claire Gottra, and Finn Arsenault. We find no ideological asymmetry in the emotional appeals politicians make. That's the work by Christian People I've already presented. Here, today, in this effective representation thing, we find mixed evidence. So in the Netherlands, we do find that right-wing voters want their leaders to be more negative, and that's also in line with some survey work that shows on average that conservatives are more negative. But we don't find this in the US, and that's actually quite interesting because on average, I'd say the likelihood of finding ideological asymmetry is a lot larger in the US than it would be in the Netherlands. But anyway, we don't find it here. We do find ideological asymmetries in terms of a minuscule, and I want to emphasize that, minuscule difference in amygdala size in a paper I've done with Diamantis again and Steven Scholten. That no one wants to publish. No, it's getting me. And none of the authors is willing to finish it. I think that's probably but also very interesting, the work of Diamantis Petropoulos Petalas is that he designed a cognitive game from which he concluded that conservatives jump to conclusions quicker in the so-called BEATS task. So there are ideological asymmetries. So in all, using these completely different research designs, we find really this sort of mixed bag. Now, I want the last detour is about political sophistication. And so political sophistication, I looked at the effect of political sophistication on these effective distances because on average, well, there's this systematic finding in political psychology that political sophisticates are the most emotional ones when it comes to politics. So it's not that if you get to know more about politics or more interested in politics, that suddenly you become more rational. The opposite is true, at least, but it's found by people who look at self-reports that sophisticates report the highest amount of emotion. And this is something that is an important part of Isabella Rabasso's dissertation. And in particular, in this paper called Disentangling the Sophistication Emotion Link, where we look at political interest, confidence in knowledge, and actual knowledge, and look at the relationships between these concepts and self-reported feelings about emotions. And so we have different ANES, American National Election Studies samples here, a Dutch sample that we collected ourselves, and another American sample that we collected ourselves. And so these are all estimates of these variables. So these are the independent variables on these self-reported emotions: hope, fear, pride, enthusiasm, anger, disgust. Now, what you see is that knowledge typically doesn't cross the zero line. So in most cases, there's no effect of actual knowledge on self-reported emotions. But you do see that interest and confidence in knowledge is not in this picture, but the findings are similar with confidence in knowledge, does seem to produce a positive effect across the board. So it seems to be the case that people who are very interested, who are very confident in their knowledge, and so this is one way of conceptualizing political sophistication. These people are scored systematically higher on self-reported emotions about politics. In the effective representation data I showed you here, I found that sophisticates want more negative emotions in the United States, but not in the Netherlands. Okay, so I replicate that finding a little bit compared to here, but it's of course a different research system. Now I'm getting to the conclusion. So a couple of open questions I'd be interested to hear your thought about regarding the effective representation part. So the paper hidden into this larger story today is, do we actually need these discrete emotions? So pride and hope, etc., because they were all pointing in the same direction. Or should we just treat these distinct emotions question as part of a larger scale positive and negative? So we use one question, the more or less question used in the US, or two questions, used versus desired. Who should be the representative we should look at? I've not asked about party leaders, but is that the relevant representative to look at? And anything else that you think, I'm happy to hear that. Now, as for the broader conclusion, I already announced that the conclusions weren't really all that connected to what I would be talking about, but maybe this is a teaser more than a conclusion. So I think there are 3 points I wanted to raise. So first of all, I started to talk about self-reports and then showed you examples of how you can also look at the body, the brain, to try to measure emotions. And one of the issues there is that these two things don't actually relate very well. The average correlation is 0. And this is not only the case with political stimuli, but with any sort of stimuli. And so for many, this has been reason to say, well, all this nonsense with wires and the body and the brain, let's not do that because it's costs so much time and it doesn't seem to do anything. But these things are picking up on different parts of the emotion episode. So the first one being much more about the unconscious processing, and the second one much more about the conscious processing. And there's nothing in the theory of emotions that would predict that these are exactly the same. If anything, this is a very complex process with lots of feedback loops. So why would we actually expect the same outcomes? The fact that there is an incongruence or lack of correlation actually reveals the richness of the effective term. That effect is a really complicated thing. that we can study in very exciting ways. Then the second conclusion I want to draw is that politics seems to generate a distinct, maybe even unique pattern of appraisals and physiological responses. So there was this paper out last summer that called for the discovery of the affectome, right? So in response to the genome, now we should finally try to nail down what the affective process is in terms of conceptualization, but also in terms of identification. So I think the fact that the appraisal patterns that Isabella found in contrasting political versus non-political appraisals are different. The fact that Micah finds that how we respond to angry faces differs, whether this is a party leader or just a normal person. I think this all suggests that there might be something like a political affectome, a subset of the larger affectome that we need to define in more detail. And so that's also a result for political psychology. Thank God there is one. Finally, effective representation, the fact that we find different results in the Netherlands and the US, also not only in terms of description, but also in terms of their relationships with sophistication and ideology, suggests to me that this is a much more dynamic thing than something very simple and very deeply, arguably deeply rooted that left likes this, right likes this. So to borrow yet another term from political science and put it on political psychology is maybe effective representation, just like some aspects of policy representation, is thermostatic. So if you're unfamiliar with that term, thermostatic theory supposes that if there's a demand for liberal policies and then these liberal policies are being made, then what happens with public opinion is that it actually moves in the other side. So suddenly people become more conservative again. And maybe this is exactly how to think about effective representation. That very angry politicians are best defeated by very positive politicians, because the demand for anger declines the more angry the politicians become, and the need for positivity increases. And on that note, I would like to thank you for listening and all of our lab partners.
All right, let's open up for questions. Ben?
Well, thank you. It was really interesting. What I wanted to ask, I might have missed, is that from this congruence part, did you also look at dislike motions from signal side? So if you use as a politician strategically more emotions, then does it lead to higher representation, larger representation, more growth, or it may have a boomerang effect that if you use more hope, then a certain group of people will dislike you as a politician, or if you go.
No, I have not made any connection yet between any sort of objective use of emotions and whether that brings about any changes in popularity. That would be the next step.
Yeah, super cool work. It immediately reminded me of the 2016 presidential elections in Austria, where one of the predictive items was for Green candidate versus radical right candidate was enthusiasm about the future, and sort of there was like a different emotional vibe and like a key message. And I was wondering, because also just before you were talking about effective polarization, especially if you make it this kind of demand versus offer also argument, or I hope that you're gonna also think about how voters think of the out parties and perceive that, and then to what degree sort of this relative proximity of emotions to like in-party versus out-party will be predicted.
And I have that data. In the Netherlands, I ask people to identify their out party, and then also the same questions. The one downside is that something like 80% of the sample identified Forum for Democracy as the out party.
Right.
And this is across, this is a representative sample, and it's across the spectrum. So also for the FA today, the most often given out party was Forum. So Yeah, that I think is a bit of a pity because I mean this party is such an outlier that in the US I didn't select people into categories, so I also have what Republicans think of Biden and what and Democrats about Trump. And I think I've looked at that data and I think they are just more extreme versions of what the partisans themselves want. So Democrats want Trump to be even less negative than the Republican partisans want him to be. But it's not as if these relationships go into different directions.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for an interesting presentation that went a bit all over the place, but
I was worried he's also going to talk for an hour.
no, yeah, I had two thoughts, and maybe they're both very related, so maybe it's just one thought. If I think about emotion, it's really a context-specific kind of response of politicians. So in general, I don't want the leader of a party that I like to be angry the whole time, or smiling or laughing or whatever the whole time. But in a specific circumstance where another politician says something that's really offensive, I would want my politician to react in an angry way. So I don't know what I would answer to or what the answers to these questions really mean, or if those responses and preferences for responses are so context specific, the concept of affective representation is a bit difficult conceptually, but also to measure it, I think. So that was one thought. And on a more, when you're trying to explain the dependent variable here, when you're trying to explain representation as a dependent variable, if it is also context specific, and if it's so much related to the very specific politician that happens to be the party leader at the time, because that's what they're responding to, how could you explain it by characteristics of the individual giving the expressing the preference? If another VVD leader comes along, VVD voters would give different types of answers. So it's not characteristics of the respondents, but it's characteristics of what they're evaluating. That's one might thought.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think I see this as an empirical question, like how context specific is this, and so I think it would be great to do some sort of follow-up survey where indeed, rather than asking these general questions, we give these situations exactly like the one you presented, something I thought of before, and perhaps we can think of more situations where, and then the question is, of course, would people differ dramatically over all these situations? So my sense would be, if someone really wants their party leader to be much more negative, I think this person would in all of these contexts say yes, the response should be angry. Whereas if you would have someone who is very mixed, like okay, if someone shouts at you should shout back, but if we're having some sort of policy discussion, then your response should be polite and not angry. My sense would be that on the variable I've used, that these people would basically score a 0 or maybe a 1, or just a minor deviation. But of course this is testable, right? And then I haven't done that yet. So it's the question whether this is enough to capture a general sense, or whether it's so context specific that the question is meaningless. And the same
Well, I
applies.
didn't use that term.
No, but I mean, I'm open to interpretation. It could be that this, I mean, the fact that there are some relation, this is also why I look at ideological asymmetry in this case, because that would be sort of a way to assess the predictive validity of this. The fact that it doesn't entirely work that way, yeah, can say something about ideological asymmetry or something about the measurement of effective representation. And also, I think it would be interesting indeed. I mean, if a party leader would change, it could very well, yeah, it's a two-way relationship, right? So it could be about your preferences, but also about what's being offered, but it remains a subjective perception of what is offered. And
But you asked them, right? When it comes to the preference, how angry would I like my leader to be?
Yeah.
So have you looked at whether that variable can be better predicted than the distance? Because the distance really depends on how angry the politician
better
is.
predicted by individual.
Ideology or whatever, some individual characteristics.
Oh, that would be a good test.
And so.
Yes, well, thank you. Impressive. This is just a thought on the question raised at the end about how to think of the representative, so party leader, government leader, etc. So it seems to me you're working with this kind of Wittgenstein style idea of representation, which is this kind of responsiveness, consequences, getting what you want. Now, in more recent literature on representation, people make a distinction between a dyadic and a triadic notion of representation. So one is, acting for someone, so X acts for X acts for Y. The other one is representing something as triadic. So it's a three-way relationship, right? So X represents Y as Z. And these can both come under that concept. Now it seems to me that we in fact want different things from different representatives, right? In a place especially where, say, the party leader is not the government leader, even though the party is in power, when you have a system like that, etc. So I'm thinking if you were to introduce this kind of distinction, if you could somehow work it through, you might get also more fine-grained account of how effective representation works in different kinds of representation. I think it's just into direction.
Yeah, there might actually be a way to do this because I made an error in the Dutch sample. Well, yeah, I mean, so people who said they voted as VVD, they were the question appeared to them as how would you rate your party leader Mark Rutte on these criteria? Then after that, I also asked another question, more as a question about I introduced that as a way to develop that other question. That was, can you answer the same question, distinct emotions, but now about our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte? And I forgot to take out the VVD vote, so I could actually contrast it. Fortunately, the VVD is not so popular. And another, what I was talking about is triadic aspects. What's of course really interesting is that Christian people find that, and this was also found in other studies, that in Parliament, the government members or the MPs of government parties, they speak more positively. Right? This is very systematic and pretty makes a lot of sense. But then in the effective distances, the VVD voters want Rutte to be much more negative.
So that's what I'm really saying is that I don't know that representation is one thing.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay, we go to a couple of questions from the online environment. First is from Jacob Kasper. The question is as follows, Gijs. How good do you think people are at assessing what they want from their politicians in terms of effective representation? Now comes an example. For instance, there is research showing that people who want positive things to go viral and for their politicians to be less consistent on social media. However, this does not seem to match with what people actually like share. So do you think there's a disconnect between what people claim to want and how they actually respond to politicians' behavior?
Yes.
It's great. Is there more questions?
But just, yeah, this paper is not about, does not give any insight in whether, if a party leader, based on this, would say, oh, I need to use more hope. There's absolutely no guarantee that this will work, because this is what people think the party leader should use, but I don't think they have much insight into what, I don't think people have a lot of insight in what sort of emotional framing works for them. So, yeah.
Okay, great. So a question from Andrea Piek. Yes, hi to everybody and to you in particular, guys. She refers back to the paper with Peter that you also refer to. So I pick up where she writes, Peter de Wilde and I conceptualize feeling represented as a visceral state subsequently to witnessing representative claims. What we do find that feeling represented is a multidimensional concept consisting of what we refer to as instrumental, expressive, and aversive representation. How do you think feeling represented relates to this type of emotional dynamic of what emotions we want to see in politicians?
Sorry, can you repeat the last sentence?
How do you think feeling represented relates to this type of emotional dynamic of what emotions we want to see in politicians?
Yeah, so in Andrea, I was looking for your paper.
Send it, Andrea.
It seems as if you also have reviewers who are not responding.
It will be submitted soon, it says.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I have a very good answer to this question yet. I definitely think the way feeling represented is conceptualized, and this way of measuring effective representation should be very closely linked. But my approach has been a bit more inspired by thinking about policy representation. So this is something they express, and what is the distance between what you want and what you need. And this is a slightly different, Andrea takes a slightly different approach, which is also great. Am I have a question?
Yeah, I was thinking related to Rutte, if it wants to be more negative, also to reduce that. That would be really interesting to see as well whether David voters have the same idea about, for instance, Sophie Hermans, because I can imagine that it would be completely different. And not only does she have a different role professionally, but she also has a different gender. And forth from your findings here with just these few parties in the Netherlands, it's really difficult to draw conclusions. But I was wondering whether you have a hunch of whether people expect different things, also related to, for instance, what Michael was telling a while ago with communal and agentic traits.
Yeah.
And a bit less related to that, but I was also thinking you asked them now what they want in terms of emotions of their politicians, but that's also a bit of a self-report question, of course.
Yes.
Do you have any idea of how to capture these other dimensions of emotions for this type of question? Because it's a lot trickier to ask them what type of emotions they would want the politicians with, without asking them that in a self-reporting kind of way.
Yeah. No, I felt after doing all these difficult things in the lab, I deserve a few easy surveys. I didn't do that. No, but you're right. But in this case, I was also really interested in what really their subjective experience. But about your first question about the gender dynamic, we have a lot of parties, but not a lot of female party leaders, fortunately. I was struck by this finding. SP, Socialist Party, there are not a lot of them in the sample. But this is a very distinct finding that they find they want Lilian Marijnissen, the female party leader, to be less angry. And this is exactly what some of the research has been showing, that women are not allowed to be angry.
But for the BBB, they wanted less positive emotions, right? The other slide.
Less positive.
Yeah, right. The BBB.
Yeah, but
Yeah, that's.
yeah, but there's no effect for BBB on negative.
No, but if you, then they.
And look, there is actually a little bit of this anchor effect is almost the same.
Okay.
Wait, there was one more. How to measure? Yeah, well, let's discuss it.
Yeah, I was just curious how you,
Yeah, there's no easy answers.
Yes, another question online from Luca Verstegen. Do voters want their politicians to be emotional at all? Capital letters, the last part. And Luca would expect that in self-reports, people rationalize their affective sympathy and say that they want rational and considered politicians who are not driven by emotion. Implicitly, however, I expect that people still would prefer emotional politicians. I guess you could also rephrase it a little bit. It's like, what would happen if you would have the option of no emotions in the options?
That's a good question. I want to pick out one aspect of this question, and that is driven by emotions. I think that's something else than showing emotions. So I forgot to mention the prompts people get before they answer these questions, and it literally said, well, no, I said it literally, but I don't know it literally. It said something like, politicians use emotions in their speeches, in their press releases, and in debates, and we're now interested in how much do you want your party leader to use these emotions. So if I would ask, how much do you think your party leader should be driven by emotions? I think that would give a completely different output. So I think that's distinction. Still, I think if we would add the no emotions answer option, I think there will be quite a few people who would say, yes, I want my politician to show no emotion, but I completely do not believe that at all. I think emotional displays for leaders are super important. Just imagine for a prime minister like Rutte, imagine the moment that all these victims from the MH17, what was it, attack came back to the Netherlands. If he would have stood there with a neutral looking face, he would have been slaughtered. Like he had to put up this whole act of an hour at least to look sad. And this is extremely important for leaders.
That would suggest that context matters, right?
Absolutely.
Because you could imagine that like handling an invasion or sort of things you want more rational.
Yeah, but
Cross contact, you had the May book. Remember Theresa May? They were accusing her of being romantic. Like, anything she did.
Yeah.
Okay, it's 4 o'clock or a minute before 4. So Gijs, thank you for this nice presentation and overview of the work that's been done and some of the work that's going on. That's great. Thank you all for being here. Also online, it's a pleasure. Next week we have Emma Turkenberg. Great, we'll hope you'll be here. Would you like to know what you're going to talk about, Emma? Effective response to uncivil politicians. And then we have Daniel Thiele from University of Vienna with a talk titled Populist User Comments, the Pandemic and Online Public. Insights from a computational text analysis in 7 European countries. Guys, I'm looking at you. Do we have a meeting at March 2nd now or not? Or March 3rd?
no, we canceled.
Okay.
No,
Yeah, you wanted no. Maybe we have a surprise meeting on March 1st, but then we have a little break, and then on March 17th, Barbara Fitz will be there. On March 24th, Luna Boetkerijk and so on, and a whole bunch of other interesting speakers as we come along. And I'm looking at Wouter. We should have you soon again. We're here, but that will be the fall. I think that will be.
I still have my cup from the last.
Oh, you first, yeah. Great, but thanks everybody. See you again next week.